Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I am one of three co-hosts today in the Wayback Machine. My name is Evan Buck, and how about my other two co-hosts introduce themselves?
Chris, do you have some magic words you want to say?
Hi, good people. It's Chris Coppola back again.
Hello, everyone. This is Dylan.
Well, now with all three of us introduced, we can hop right into the meat and bones of our topic today. Dylan, what are we discussing?
So given the time of the year and time of the season, we are discussing the internecine and minute details of mid-18th century American presidential elections. So
because tis the season,
timely.
Tis the season, right? This is the best time of year to be talking about this.
Exactly.
Yes. So today we are going to be discussing the famed or infamous election of 1876, one that is, among historians, pretty well known for its rancor and just all around intriguing possibilities. So I'm going to set up the background here and our fork, and then we'll just kind of delve into the possibilities after that. So with the election of 1876, 76, of course, 100 years after our nation's founding in 1776. So it's our centennial celebration. And we are coming off of the heels of the Civil War in the 1860s. And so there's a lot of emotions going on with this election. There's a lot of wrangling over post-Civil War policies. And we had, after Abraham Lincoln's untimely demise, we had his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who avoided impeachment by one vote. And then after him, we had two terms of a pretty famous guy. You might have heard his name. You might have seen his picture on some $50 bills. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, or as I like to call him, U.S. Grant. I don't think you can get anybody more American than somebody who has U.S. in their initials. I suppose if you had someone with the initials USA, America has to do that. I don't think that's happened yet. So someday we'll get the most American president possible. So we're now at the end of two terms of Union war hero Ulysses S. Grant. And although he was a rather upstanding and honorable individual, his presidency really was not. Kind of left a lot to be desired, pretty corrupt, a lot of rent seeking, that sort of thing. Ulysses S. Grant is probably most well known for getting the 15th Amendment through, which was enfranchising African Americans. But outside of that, there really isn't a lot that's super notable outside of a panic of 1876. This was our nation's first, I guess what you can call Great Depression. Like, we had economic issues before, of course, but it's kind of like how when World War I happened, it wasn't called World War I because there wasn't a World War II. It was called the Great War. This panic was called the Great Depression. And until, of course, we had a later Great Depression that superseded it. The domination of the Republicans at this time was pretty noteworthy. The Democrat Party did not actually even run a candidate in 1872 for Grant's reelection campaign. It was the liberal Republicans under Horace Greeley. So there was actually talk of the possible extinction of the Democratic Party a la the Whigs a few decades earlier. It wasn't super likely, but it was a possibility. So now enter our two candidates. We have Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a pretty upstanding, honorable, dark horse candidate from the Republicans, a congressman from Ohio, if I believe. And then we have the governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden. This was not a very issues-based election. This was one that was mainly focused on, rallying people under the flag, mudslinging, all that kind of stuff. Probably the most famous Republican slogan from this time was, "Not every Democrat was a rebel, but every rebel was a Democrat." And this is where we also get the phrase "waving the bloody shirt." In the wake of the Civil War, the Republicans definitely ran a campaign that was mainly focused on airing those Civil War grievances. The Democrats, however, were also not lacking for their incendiary rhetoric, and they had a slogan, "Tilden or blood." The threat of violence was real. And another thing that hallmarked this election was voter suppression. Voter suppression was pretty rampant in the post-Civil War South. African Americans were, very drawn to the party of Lincoln, who had, given the Emancipation Proclamation. And so there was a lot of shady business going on both sides, but especially most notably with the Democrats in the post-Civil War South. Hayes was rather progressive for his time. He was a Reconstructionist, and he was very pro-civil rights for the newly enfranchised African Americans. But he was also kind of trying to walk a tightrope act. He was very conciliatory to the South. Tilden, on the other hand, he was mainly an anti-corruption campaign, and especially in light of what's going on with U.S. Grant's administration, this appealed to a lot of folks who were pretty tired of, what the Republican-dominated government had done. As we've discussed several times on this podcast in the past, it's just the weight of inertia of having a party staying in power for too long, for like 2 terms, 3 terms. It's very difficult to get over past that 3-term limit, as we've seen by and large in American politics. I kind of don't really count Andrew Johnson because even though he was a Democrat, let's be honest, his administration was incredibly stymied by the radical Republican Congress. So we basically had Republican domination of the presidency for a while.
And he didn't win election as president as a Democrat.
Yep, exactly.
He took over because of Lincoln's Republican victory in 1864.
Exactly. Yep. So all in all, we've had Republican domination of the presidency for a good, I'd say maybe 14, 15 years at this point, if I'm doing my math right. So by all indications, I would imagine it was time for the pendulum to swing back. So election day comes. Tilden leads the popular vote by about 260,000 votes or so. And there were 3 states that could not be called. So Tilden had 184 votes. Hayes had 165. And the results in 3 states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, were all in doubt. They were all in question. So Tilden was on the doorstep of the presidency. He only needed 1 more vote to win. But the astute Republicans noted that if Hayes swept those 3 outstanding states, then he would win 19 more college votes, and thus the election 185 to 184. Those 3 states were Republican legislature. They had Republican legislators. They were controlled by Republicans. The electoral boards there basically all argued that fraud, intimidation, and violence in certain districts invalidated votes. So they took it upon themselves to throw out enough Democratic votes so that Hayes could win those states. All 3 of these electoral boards decided to award their votes to Hayes. And then on the flip side, we have an interesting development going on in Oregon that threw some more uncertainty into the mix. Hayes won the state pretty comfortably, but one of the Republican electors, John Watts, was postmaster, and the U.S. Constitution specifically forbids federal office holders from being electors. So Watts, he planned to resign from his post in order to become a electoral college voter for Hayes, but the Democratic governor of Oregon instead decided to disqualify Watts and instead insert a certified Tilden elector. So we have 20 votes in question, and we have dueling competing slates of electors that were submitted to Congress for the certification of votes in December of 1876. If this is giving you vibes or throwbacks to what happened in the 2020 election, you would not be mistaken, except we actually didn't have, dueling electors in that case. But in 1876, we did. Something to keep in mind as well is that we had not changed inauguration to January at this point, we still had inauguration happening in March. So from November to March was basically like 6 months of a lame duck administration. To put it bluntly, this was an absolute mess. Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. Republicans controlled the Senate. They both disagreed as to what to do here. And the Constitution did not have a specific mechanism to resolve this. So, folks, we got ourselves a bona fide constitutional crisis. So finally, on January 29th of 1877, Congress reaches a compromise. They establish a extra-legal electoral commission from the Electoral Commission Act, which was composed of 5 senators, 5 representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices. And you might wonder how you have an ideological split be even on this. And what they did was they basically had 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. One of the Supreme Court justices was nominally independent. We'll get into that later on in the fork. And they were basically convened to decide which votes they were going to count and to resolve this big dispute. However, that independent Supreme Court justice, David Davis, he refused to serve on the commission because he was angling for running for an Illinois Senate seat. So he was instead replaced by a Republican justice. So on March 12th, 1877, after much hand-wringing and mudslinging and whatever other slinging and ringing that you can think of, the Senate president declared Hayes to be the president-elect of the United States after the commission voted 8-7 to count the votes in the 3 outstanding states for Hayes. So Hayes won 185 to 184. And if any American out there knows about Rutherford B. Hayes, they probably know him by his nicknames. He was dubbed His Fraudulency and Rutherfraud B. Hayes by a bitter Democratic press. And so inauguration was on March 4th. So keep in mind, this instability and not knowing who was president lasted from Election Day until 2 days before the inauguration. As you can imagine, this rigmarole made us want to have policies and procedures in place so that this wouldn't happen again. So the Electoral Count Act of 1887, 10 years later, was passed.
Every election since then has been decided, and nobody has right and other fairy tales.
Exactly. So, we all like to say, hey, and it all ended happily ever after. Well, not exactly with some recent happenings. So basically, to wrap up the background, we have a very tumultuous time in American politics. What's new? So, with all of this background established, let's hop down some of these possible forks. So, I'll throw out what I think is the least likely fork, and we can discuss that for a little bit. So, in the wake of this election, there was, like I mentioned, a lot of fraud that was going on, a lot of intimidation, a lot of threats of electoral violence. And so the specter of a march on DC was actually raised. And Ulysses S. Grant basically said, not happening, not on my watch. So he fortified DC in wake of the election. And between that and the Compromise of 1877, nothing actually happened. So the first possible fork is, well, what if Grant didn't do this? And what if election violence actually occurred? Chris or Dylan, you want to think about some of those possibilities?
By the way, I think it's important. I've been trying to figure out how to mention this. It's important to think we are not talking about election. We're specifically talking in this case about violence around the inauguration. There was electoral violence in this election.
Right. True.
There was plenty of it. It just didn't occur, within my commuting distance. Basically. Because the reason those 3, listen, we have an international audience. I want to point out something. Where were those 3 states located? What region of the country are they in? The South.
In the South.
Every single one of those states was part of the Confederacy, and the state electoral boards that threw out those Democratic votes were all Reconstruction governments.
Yes, that is actually very important to note because in light of, what was going on with Reconstruction, we had Republican legislators dominating a lot of these states for a while. Now, whether that accurately reflected the will of the voters, if we know know anything about, post-Civil War South, I would say probably not. But
well, I'm going to go ahead and complicate what you just said, Evan. Will of the voters. Who are the voters? Because
exactly.
You just had a whole bunch of people. You had a huge swing that had just happened. You had a whole bunch of African Americans who were now allowed to vote. And then you also had a whole bunch of people who had just committed treason and therefore were not allowed to vote.
Exactly. And so this is why I was going to mention the idea of like Abraham Lincoln's clemency, which was essentially, we'll let the state back in if 10% of registered voters, just sign this pledge to America. Now, that's not a very high bar. And so it's not quite as cut and dry or black and white, assuming that like all these states would be Republican or all these states would be Democrat. But I would say that by and large, the newly enfranchised African Americans would by and large be Republican, and most of the, antebellum Southern, voters from before would probably be inclined to support the Democrats. So I think with this fork, it's not very likely, that we could jump down this really interesting rabbit hole of what would dueling presidencies look like? Would America become kind of, like Mexicanization or things like that? But we just came off the Civil War. U.S. Grant is, who again is a Union general who helped win the war for the North. I think this is very unlikely that he would just let a bunch of Inauguration Day related violence happen. Americans weren't exactly in a mood, despite the electoral violence that occurred, weren't really in a mood to relitigate the Civil War again. I think
one of the reasons this happens is because of the resistance to occupation of the South. The U.S. is sick of this, and one of the parts of the Compromise of 1876 is ending Reconstruction.
Yep. Because again, we have federal troops occupying, these legislator grounds, and as a result of this compromise, which we'll be getting into with the fork, that ends. Hayes pulls them out. So that leads to the next possible fork. The Electoral Commission can count the votes all for Tilden instead of Hayes. Now, Dylan, do you think this is a very likely possibility?
Well, I famously went to law school to not do math, but I'm pretty sure this is not going to end the way that we're kind of angling for. Just from a sheer mathematical perspective, 8 always beats 7 if they have 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. So I don't think, unless people really don't understand how numbers work, I don't think there's any shot.
No. And the thing is that this commission, started with 7, 7, and 1, at least on the face of it. But yeah, I think you're pretty spot on there. Unless you're talking about how 7, 8, 9. 8 is greater than 7. So with this in mind, we arrive at what I think is the most likely fork and the one that we're going to delve into for the rest of the episode. Remember that guy that I mentioned before, the nominally independent Supreme Court Justice. He is a gentleman by the name of David Davis. And the fork that we are going to be going down today is, what if David Davis remained the last member of the commission instead of Joseph P. Bradley? And this, I think, is not only the most likely fork, but also one that would have probably very likely resulted in a Tilden presidency. The reason I think this is because Davis was renowned for being a fiercely independent individual. He was very widely respected across the nation. Like, basically think of someone like, Now this isn't the greatest example because he was, a bit left of center, but like a Walter Cronkite, someone that is widely respected across the entire spectrum of American politics and someone who can be rather trusted to be fair and impartial. So think of somebody like that.
I'd
Interestingly
maybe
enough,
throw in like a John McCain, like somebody who might have been from one, Cronkite wasn't involved in politics. And Dylan, do not even try and debate me that Supreme Court justices are not political, because we just got into saying.
Oh, that's not going to be an argument you and I have to worry about. Trust me.
But I feel like a John McCain is an updated example of this, because he was so, there was such a sense of, okay, he's a Republican, but he's just as likely to buck.
He's a maverick.
Right.
Yeah. You don't know where he might end up on a certain issue. So definitely. So you have your Walter Cronkite, you have your John McCain kind of figure in David Davis, well respected across the ideological spectrum. He would have been the only person to have single-handedly selected a president. I don't imagine that this individual, with all of his, work on the Supreme Court and everything that was going on shady in this election, I don't think he would have had the wool pulled over his eyes. And so me personally, and there's actually this quote when I was doing my research here, it says, no one, perhaps not even Davis himself, knew which presidential candidate he preferred. I don't personally feel that Davis would have tried to been in the business of trying to select which votes counted and which votes didn't. To me personally, I feel like he would have just taken most of the results as he saw them coming in. I don't think he was going to try to disqualify votes on the basis of, voter fraud and intimidation, those sorts of things. So if we're going with the fact that Davis would buck the Republican legislators' submissions and instead believed that, Tilden had won those votes, Davis didn't even need to give all those states to Tilden. He only needed to give one electoral vote. So if one of those three states, in his opinion, went to Tilden, Tilden won the election. So this, I think, unless there are any objections, I think this is the fork that we should delve into.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, speak now for hold your peace.
Yeah, I think it's one, it avoids a whole lot of headaches that it makes the least mountain out of a molehill, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. We're not trying to invent causes on causes to make this thing work. And I think the real question is, that we have to, assume that, Tilden wins the presidency. Okay, what does a Tilden presidency look like? I mean, obviously, for one, the Democrats are actually a thing. They've come back from the brink almost like a Rocky, type story.
It's literally like a hypersonic rocket launch because, again, remember, the Democrats have been boxed out of the presidency for a while. The previous election, they almost got extinguished as a national entity. So this would have represented one of the hardest pendulum swings in politics, not so much on an ideological ground, because, again, this election was mainly just kind of tribalistic, nothing really new. Of course, there were issues that were discussed and debated and policy differences, but mainly it was kind of more of an emotional sort of appeal. So we would have had the Democrats coming back into the presidency much sooner than they did in our timeline. Grover Cleveland was the next Democratic president. He didn't come in until 1885. So until then, Johnson's term, after Lincoln being the exception, we had Republicans from the 1860s to 1885.
Yeah, and not just that, other than Grover Cleveland, the next Democrat was Woodrow
Wilson.
Who we famously do not like on this podcast.
Eric Rush, we miss you.
Yeah. And I do. I guess there's one thing that I want to kind of dive into, because, we talk about, this election is famously kind of the end of Reconstruction. That's the compromise. That's basically the devil's bargain that gets the Republicans another technically it's like 12 years, but they get another 4 just out of this.
Yeah.
So the immediate reaction that you kind of want to say is, oh, a Democrat wins an election. This is immediately going to be, just kind of absolute, hell for, newly freed slaves living in the South. I actually think don't get me wrong, I'm not going to disagree with the idea that things are going to be worse in a lot of ways, but I think it's more nuanced than that, because Tilden himself was a New York Democrat, not a Southern Democrat. He platformed on this anti-corruption platform. I mean, that's one of the things that made it so close. He got boss tweet out of New York and Tammany Hall. So I think, on the one hand, I think Reconstruction would certainly end. I don't think there's any real question about that. But at least part of Tilden doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would just immediately let former Confederates get free reign.
No,
I want to say
Reconstruction
might end, but it actually, Tilden would have made sure, I feel like, that some form of monitoring was actually still going on, and you're not having a complete reversal. Whether that's some sort of revised or more enforced civil rights legislation, I'm not sure, but I just want to say that I don't think this is going to devolve into the sort of like hellscape that people might first immediately think that it's going to be, because there's a lot more structure that's involved in terms of this, Northern Democrat as opposed to a Southern. And I think that gets at the sort of question of, okay, what does a new Democratic Party look like? Does it just look like this party of Southern reactionaries, or do we start seeing kind of the beginnings of what's going to be a party realignment that never really happened in our timeline? What do y'all think?
I think that's a really fascinating premise, because looking at what we see and from our own timeline, as you mentioned, the deal with the devil, the Compromise of 1877, was Hayes was going to end Reconstruction. Now, the thing is that Hayes actually campaigned on not really ending Reconstruction, but he basically already agreed to do that even before the Compromise happened. So this was something that I think, we talk about, the great forces of history versus the one key person. This is definitely where I think the forces of history were already bucking this idea of Reconstruction continuing at all, really.
I also kind of feel, as an American, I think we can all agree, when we were in history class, it was basic, like at least, up to high school. It was, okay, Lincoln got elected, Civil War, World War One.
Right,
like
yeah.
Basic,
this is like kind of just a little speed
maybe
bump.
the Gilded Age and the Little Bighorn.
Right.
At best.
Yeah. This period of like presidencies in history to me reminds me of some of the pre-Civil War presidents. You have Andrew Jackson, and then you basically just kind of skip ahead to Lincoln.
Buchanan's in there somewhere and Van Buren's in there somewhere, and you don't remember anybody else, and you don't remember who's in what order.
Nope. And the most reviled presidents, according to historians, by and large, I would say, are like, Pierce and Buchanan, and like nobody's heard of them, So this is one of those parts of American history where I would say the presidency was not as strong, which is interesting because we just came off of, President Lincoln, who did a lot to, consolidate power in a stronger executive branch, I would say. And so it's interesting to me that, like, in our timeline, we still did not really see a lot of, I would say, effectual, strong personalities that really had, could really use the force of that reimagined executive power. So to get to more back to your point, I think I agree that Tilden would not have done a lot to like actively support, bad things happening in the South. Because I thought of this possibility of like federal support for organizations like, the Red Shirts in the South. But I agree with you, Dylan, that I don't think Tilden was ideologically that way. He's a Northern Democrat. Let's be real. In this election, I think Tilden was going to be the only kind of Democrat who really had a chance to win. Hayes won the North.
He won that majority of
Right.
popular opinion. Yeah. I mean, he won an absolute majority of popular opinion. So clearly he was doing something that a lot of people really liked and sort of stuck onto. So I think he is probably the unicorn in this one. I wonder. So there's an interesting the thing that this is making me think of, and so there's an interesting trend among a few post-Civil War Confederate generals. Longstreet is one. Beauregard is another one who was kind of a surprise to me until I started looking into it. This sort of odd streak that you wouldn't expect of pro-civil rights, pro-enfranchisement Confederate generals. Now, Longstreet famously got some attacks over his war record and some things like that. So, these guys would face an uphill battle. But do you think that these kind of generals, assuming that they can find a place in a sort of more neutral, more even-handed Northern Democrat administration, do you think this is potentially a way for some of these wayward Confederate political figures to get back into not necessarily politics, although it's hard to imagine Longstreet wouldn't somehow end up in a cabinet position. I mean, he was considered for Secretary of the Navy at one point. But sort of, and I guess what I'm really getting at is, does this represent an opportunity for some, post-Civil War Confederates to almost have an opportunity for a rapprochement instead of just kind of being demonized by a constantly ascendant Republican Party for 20 years? I wonder if some of the acrimony that characterized the South in this period might actually be not a huge amount, but somewhat less acrimonious in this timeline. If you can get some of these Confederate generals back into the sort of political fold.
I think that's a very interesting possibility. And I think, because if we look in our timeline, because Tilden was, denied the presidency in what a lot of people saw as a corrupt bargain, I think this just kind of incensed, a lot of the Democrats and made as you say, a sort of rapprochement to be a lot less likely. I feel like divisions, were kind of deepened as a result of what was seen as an unfair, advantage given to Hayes. As we like to say on this podcast, you change events, you change people. So Hayes ultimately, his presidency isn't really, he's another one of those presidents who wasn't super notable. And I think part of that is because he being, and, again, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Hayes himself seems to be a pretty honest guy. He seems to be a pretty upstanding individual. And part of why he won as a dark horse candidate was because he didn't really have any of the Grant administration's corruption tied to him in any sort of way. So the thing is, though, is that Hayes still had this specter, this sword of Damocles hanging over him of being fraudulently elected. So, and he was kind of backed into a corner in a certain way to make this compromise of 1877 so that the Democrats would stand down and, essentially let him become president in exchange for allowing the South to have essentially unmitigated home rule. So in this timeline, he doesn't make those concessions. He is not president. And Tilden would come in not having this, specter hanging over him. Because unless we would make the argument that it would be just the sides reversed and the Republicans would be mad and think that Tilden won, illegitimately. But I think it's a much harder argument to make when you lead the election with 260,000 votes and with almost 51% of the popular vote. Yes, for our non-American audiences, the Electoral College works differently. We don't just, first past 50% in presidential politics, then they win. But I think it's a lot less likely that Tilden would have had this, kind of monkey on his back. So I don't know. I think maybe possible rapprochement with some of these former Confederate generals. That's not something I thought about. Something that I think is more likely.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any there, but it's one of those things that's just weird enough that I wanted to bring it up because it's kind of something that gets forgotten about.
I mean, I feel like these particular generals may have seen some measure of rehabilitation. I think this may have been. I think the interesting argument is: how does James Longstreet deal or interact with the lost cause theory?
Oh, he strongly was against it. I mean, that was one of the fights that he was constantly having because he actually there's a story of him basically leading the defense against a riot that kind of popped up by some of these lost causers, and he was, out of all the Confederate generals, probably the most against this sort of lost cause thing.
But if he's rehabilitated and has, to a northern audience, I guess, a sheen of respectability, how does that influence what eventually becomes of the law? He lost that fight in our timeline.
Yeah. Well, and I think it presents a kind of alternative outlet for those kind of feelings. It's not just, oh, we were, doomed to, blah, 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 insert your whatever reason you actually want to put. But I think,
again, the Civil War is referred to by lost causers as what? The War of Northern Aggression.
The War of Northern Aggression,
right?
Yeah.
And so this feeds into that narrative of after we lost the war, we were dominated by the other side and the North for over 20 years. They have a license to basically complain on how things were done after, the Civil War was lost.
And by the way, I would like to ask any of our audience members in any other country to let us know how well complaining about having lost a civil war has worked out in your polity's history.
Yes, please. We'd love to hear that. So anyway, I think that, having in our timeline, like the lost causers, this, I guess you can say strengthened cause for license to complain about things, whether or not it's legitimate or valid. Whereas if, possibly we have the other side coming, winning the election in 1876 and having, kind of rehabilitated images for some of these, Confederate generals, these heroes, and they are the primary voices now essentially saying, no, this is not what happened. We know what we signed up for. We know what we fought for. And now it's time for us to move past and heal as a nation. This could lead to a overall, I guess, sooner ? It somehow, and this is kind of weird to think about it because again, Hayes was more of the pro civil rights, side, Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But if we really have this set of grievances addressed with a tilted victory, then this could have, I think in the immediate effect, it would have entrenched, of course, Democratic control and a lot of the repression of African Americans that already happened in our timeline. That's not really unique. But perhaps the attitudes would have been softened to such a degree that civil rights could have happened sooner, possibly.
Yeah, I think it would definitely at least alter the political landscape of the late 1800s to where, the whole apparatus of Jim Crow laws and civil rights legislation, I think would be different because obviously if you have a Democratic Party that one is more of an actual oppositional force to Republicans on the political scene and not just in the sort of guerrilla, Bush warfare sort of way. And, because if they're actually having a political debate, then you start getting into these more nuanced discussions instead of just, hey, we're going to put a cross and set it on fire and ride around in white hoods all the time. But also I think it's one of those things where it's hard to know the exact makeup of it. On the one hand, you've got like Plessy Ferguson, I'm sure would probably still happen just because the makeup of a Supreme Court is something that changes much, much slower than in real time. So I think, things like separate but equal would still be kind of the law of the land. But other protections, would African Americans be shut out of polls with, sort of voting tests and not, at least certain jurisdictions. I'm sure some, there's always going to be some counties in Mississippi and Alabama that, you practically have to marry your cousin just to be able to vote down there. But, is it a slightly easier time? Is it sort of a more even playing field? I think certainly. One thing I want to kind of get to, just to make sure that we touch on it, so it's not just kind of an internal policies, episode, is so, this is also noted as being a period of great change, in the, one, Americans fear the closing of the West, all that sort of stuff. Just for context, 1876 is when the Little Bighorn happened. So Custer has literally been killed like 4 months before this election. So Custer's gone. The Transcontinental Railroad's already here. They found gold in them Thar Hills. I don't know what you think, Evan, but me personally, I don't think the closing of the West is going to really look all that different from how it's going to be in our timeline. Some of the names may change, but the general trend of, the railroads come, the bison disappear, reservations, all of that, I don't think that changes. I'm curious, and Chris, I know you're kind of our resident foreign policy guy too. Do you think this changed, from Hayes to Tilden, and then, whatever happens after that? Do you think this does anything to sort of the wider American foreign policy?
No.
Okay, glad we got that sorted out.
Because
great conversation, guys.
I do have one interesting point I'm going to come back to, though. I think, at this point, the United States has basically transitioned into a cavalry constabulary force that patrols the West. And we are not a player in world affairs at this point. The one thing that goes through my mind is this, and we normally wait until the end to plug the Discord, but I'm going to go ahead and plug it now because there was an interesting map we put out there, and I'll be honest, like for even myself, I realize for a lot of people, there's all these boxy states out there that we can't really tell apart. However, I think it's possible that a Tilden administration may actually change some of those boxy states. Dakota.
Yep, I was just going to say.
Absolutely.
Only one of them.
Yes.
Only one.
And I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of these closing of the West and the territorial admission to the United States was kind of done in a way to ensure, like to this day, that's Republican country. And it was done to ensure a Republican Senate in some ways. So I think it's possible that a Tilden administration admits Dakota. Now, the other interesting thing that comes to is this. There's might be more people that live in my county that live in both the Dakotas. When we get to, and trust me, I'm not even suggesting we get to anything further down the pike with this, but listen, if we don't have these piddly little three vote states, how does that possibly change other electoral settlements?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's actually
just
really
the makeup of the states themselves. How does that play?
Yeah.
And this.
So did we reach a timeline where Wyoming actually exists?
I feel like maybe it does. Maybe we found a way to stop it from existing. Yeah.
I was going to say maybe the Garfield joke becomes reality where Wyoming, in fact, not that it exists now, but it doesn't actually exist, and it's part of it's in like in the Dakota. You've got a bigger Idaho or something. Yeah, It's interesting. I didn't think about that one.
Yeah, no, I didn't think about that either. For those of you who aren't in the know, we name dropped the Discord because that's where the Wyoming conspiracy was recently discussed.
Eric Rush, your influence continues.
The ghost of Eric Rush continues to preside over our podcast. I think something interesting to think about here as well, not just like the composition or makeup of states, but we also have the economic backdrop of what's going on here as well. Again, kind of more of an internal discussion, internal state politics. But I feel like it was very likely for the pendulum to swing back this election anyway, because we have a kind of a double whammy combo. We have a presidency known for very noted for its corruption and its rent seeking, and against the backdrop of a lot of really suffering, hurting people with the economy. Usually not a great thing to be known for in the midst of an economic crisis. So I'm curious if Tilden would have done anything different, how the economy was handled after that point. And really this idea, I think, and kind of, I know I just dropped that and I'm kind of going back to a previous discussion here, but I'll just, as long as I'm thinking about it, I'll mention it as well. I think part of why the, post-Reconstruction South played out the way it did is because of how emotional this election and other elections surrounding this time period went. But, it was the GOP in this election that, again, like I said, waved the bloody shirt. And they really stirred up a lot of anti-Confederate, just basically reminding the electorate, look, the Democrats are the ones who did the Civil War. They're the bad guys. You got to vote against them, right? And the Democrats, in turn, again, this whole kind of, maybe a little bit of a lost cause thing, a little bit of Yankee domination, animosities against the North still going on. So if we have a Northern Democrat winning, a little bit of an oxymoron in this time period, not very common, as was noted, a unicorn, maybe these sectional animosities are going to die down a little bit, and we can focus more on figuring out how do we get our economy out of this funk instead of kind of just rehashing all of these,
the grievances of the past. Basically.
Grievances of the past. Yeah. That's kind of what I think might go on here. Now, me personally, I don't really know if there was even all of that massive a difference between the two parties and when it comes to economy. This was kind of the beginning, if I remember right, of the whole like Greenback Party movement, that sort of thing.
I think if anything was going to do it, I'd say you'd see a pivot of the Democrats to being kind of a almost like a farm party or an agrarian party, which they did kind of
smaller government, Thomas Jeffersonian vision of an agrarian America.
Yeah. William Jennings Bryan about 20 years early is what I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. Because that they would want to keep greenbacks because that triggers inflation, predominantly farmers, especially maybe that's how they do it. They use that as combined with a sort of settlement drive for expansion out west to make farmland cheaper, easier for farmers to pay off their debts. That's a cross country appeal. So that alleviates some sectional differences. And you see sort of a trend earlier than our timeline to sort of get away from the gold standard, at least in part. You start seeing us go to, not a true floating currency standard, but, greenbacks become more common in the 1880s, maybe. You have silver and maybe even some other metals being used as a supplement to gold to back the currency. I think that's where the economic policy gets kind of interesting and sort of what does that do to areas of the country where we consider them to be flyover states, nothing but corn.
It's a lot of big talk from somebody in Tennessee.
As a Californian, I'm staying out of this.
What are you talking about? Believe it or not, we have technology here. We are north of Mississippi. I know how to read. Thank you very much.
Ooh, shots fired.
It's
shots
okay.
Fired. Yeah. I mean, I think this really just would have reinforced and re-entrenched like the party, like, party realignment in terms of, the Democrats being more well known as being like the bigger government party, the Republicans being known as the smaller government party. With the whole civil rights thing happening in the 60s, like the parties switched and realigned. I feel like this would have probably, I think, if the Democrats win under a more, kind of like Tilden was known for basically campaigning against corruption and excessive taxation. And so he really wanted to come in and just like kind of cut and burn a lot of expenditures. And so with that in mind, and the whole greenback movement as well, leading to, and this goes back to Chris, your like discussion of, treatment of Indian tribes and the such. Well, if we have a government that's promoting the greenback policy and wanting to make it easier to go out and purchase farmland out west, we're probably going to have more confrontation with these Indian nations, probably not really terribly different from what we see in our timeline, because expansion was going to expand no matter what. We came off the back of, James K. Polk and the whole, the name of his movement is escaping me at the moment, Manifest Destiny, right? So we had Manifest Destiny. We already had this idea of wanting to build up the West and everything. So if we're slashing taxes, slashing expenditures, and basically trying to rejuvenate the economy by sending a bunch of people packing out west, this would probably kind of delayed the party realignment from the Democrats being a bigger government party and the Republicans being a smaller government party. I think this probably would have entrenched party differences just the opposite of how we think of them now. I don't know how long that would have taken place. And maybe this one election is not going to do that on a permanent basis. But I think that for sure, if Tilden's able to get through a lot of what he wants to get through, then that just has very big ripple effects for, like economic policies further down the line.
I think what I'm thinking about is, in a weird understanding way, this may actually entrench what's going to turn into what you're talking about with the parties. If you look at the Democrats at this point, a coalition of dispossessed Southerners and dispossessed Northern immigrants, that's kind of who the party is at this point. And during the whole Gilded Age, there is a marriage of, government and capital. So I feel like that's the Republican side of this. As we get into the progressive era, people begin to feel like the government can actually solve some of these problems. So I think the Democrats, as a party of the dispossessed, that's how they turn into the big government party. And I think this could help entrench that path.
That could be. That could very well be. And I have kind of one last thought that is, I tend to be the person that just throws a bomb at the end of towards the end of an episode and back away slowly. That kind of seems to be my trend.
As opposed to me, who likes to do it in the middle. Of the episode.
Exactly. Yeah. I kind of want to have something for all parts of the episode, so someone has to listen into the end to hear what's going to be dropped. But I appreciate both measures for sure. But something that I thought about is, look, if there were no shenanigans going on in this election, if it was a pretty clean, like, Tilden win, I think it's pretty likely that we maybe do not have a Electoral Count Act of 1887, or we maybe have a weaker one. And that, I think, could lead to some interesting, results further down the line.
So basically after this point, people respect the outcome of elections and we don't have any more disputed elections? You're saying that we're actually going to, if we don't pass this act, we will have to refight the presidency every 4 years?
It's a possibility. That's just something I thought about, because a huge reason why that act happened is this election. And so if we have this result turn the other way, to where the candidate with more of the popular vote, and who, by I would say a lot of indications, we're talking about the macro, what's going on, most of the indications would have led to the party in power being kicked out, right? If that happens, then we probably would have had more of like a trust in government, more of respect for this election result here, and thus not as much of a need to pass this act. So then if we look further down the road, I mean, the only real other election I can think of right now that was hyper contested anywhere near this was the election of 2000, Bush versus Gore.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that happened with this act in place. So if we had any other future elections, and I didn't do this in my research, for this one, but if we had any other really close elections that were decided with this in place, that could have also gone a different way, or that could have, also led to this sort of electoral codification happening further down the line. So I don't know. That's just another thing I wanted to drop in there.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Any other last minute thoughts
to finish up? All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming back to another episode. Thanks for sticking with us through. It was a more internally focused episode than we usually do. Usually we find at least some way to throw a foreign policy monkey wrench in there somewhere, but it's okay. We'll make up for it somehow. I have no doubt.
I think we will.
We've already brought up, if you have any other topic suggestions, go check out the Discord. Let us know what you think of the episode. Throw out any other alternate history ideas you've got in there. Feel free to, obviously leave us a rating and review on Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts. And I guess until next time, if there's a fork in the road that you happen to come across, what do you think we should do?
I think we should take it.
All right. Until next time, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.